Hello, hello. Good evening. Good to see you all here. We are excited that you could join us online and in person for our conversation on sustaining your creative life. I'm Yaritza Benitez, the events manager for the Office of Events at CIIS, a nonprofit university, and we're here today in San Francisco on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yelamu. I want to begin with expressing our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. This acknowledgement is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community. We invite you to learn about and support Indigenous communities near you. There will be a Q&A following the conversation tonight. For those of you in the room, there is a QR code on your program, on your seat, that links to the form where you can write your question. If you're online, you'll find that same link in the event description below this video. Chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see it. Our speakers tonight are Cindy Shearer and Emlyn Guiney. Cindy Shearer, professor and program chair for the MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts and Writing at CIIS, is the author of Stay With Writing, Practices for Sustaining the Writer's Work and Life. She also designed and co-leads the creative dissertation pathway focusing on art practice as research for the PhD in East-West psychology at CIIS. A recent essay, 13 Acts of Seeing Further, Creative Writing as Text Image Art and A Quest for Care, appears in Empathy in Creative Writing, Ethics, Diversity, and Communication. She is a writer, text image artist, curator, writing mentor, and coach. Emlyn Guiney is an Oakland-based theater artist and director working in physical theater and device performance for the last 20 years. She creates original solo and ensemble performances that illuminate the magical, wild, and absurd of everyday life. Emlyn has a BA in theater arts from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and studied device theater and Buto, Japanese dance theater, with companies in Canada and Australia. She currently leads solo and ensemble explorations at Wild Theater, a laboratory for device performance making. When she is not making art, she curates public conversations and workshops for CIIS public programs. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Cindy Shearer and Emlyn Guiney.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to those in the room and those online. This is such a treat.
For sure.
As Yaritza said, I am usually producing the events, and so I get to be up on stage in our glorious chairs and talking to Cindy, which is really just delightful. I'm very excited.
And my great honor to be able to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Yay.
And thank you to all of you for coming.
Yes. So this is going to be a fun conversation all about artistic process and nurturing that, dealing with the ups and downs of that. And I thought as a way in, I would ask you sometimes a thorny question for those of us in the arts, which is when you get the question, so what is it that you do? How do you answer that?
Yeah, great question, and one that I'm always asking other people, what do you do? So let me see if I can answer it. I think I do a lot of things, and I think one of the things that is kind of instrumental in the way that I talk about writing and work in the other arts is that understanding that many of us hold lots of capacities. in our lives, among them that we're artist or artist writer. And so just to be clear here, I think of writers as artists. It's been one of my really strong pursuits in developing the MFA, to get writers to understand that they are literary artists. That's the phrasing I used to use. And so when I use the phrase artist, I'm always talking about writers as well as anybody who works in other mediums. But for me, what I do mostly these days is write. And I really write from a perspective I do mostly two kinds of writing. I do some fiction writing, but when I work in nonfiction, I really work a lot in the perspective of trying to understand what we do when we make creative work. I'm super interested in that. I've been exploring that a lot of my adult life, but particularly since we started our MFA in 2009. And my book reflects that. It reflects that idea of that I'm trying to be in the process, and I'm also trying to observe and explore the process. I do sometimes still make work in text and image. I did a piece for the new book, and I can talk more about why I do that, but I do that more professionally right now and more as part of that process of trying to understand how and why I make art.
Yeah, yeah. I ask you that because you have a really great way of talking about art making that feels both expansive for people to really just embrace the multitudes within an artist or a writer, um, and yet you also offer that specificity too. Can you say more about artists as writers
Yes,
and writers as
and writers
artists?
as artists. Yeah, I mean, for me, like a foundational piece for me in the being an artist is the what you make and the why you make it, and those things really apply across any medium or form. If you've ever been to one of my MFA info sessions, you hear me talk about this, but a lot of the origins for me was as a young writer, I got really interested in the work of Gertrude Stein. And I spent time when I was in London in graduate school going to the British Library every day, getting Stein's manuscript, or connecting to her manuscripts and books and trying to understand. For me, she was one of the first people to raise the idea that writing could be more than writing, like that it could have a visual capacity. And I began to explore that some in my own work. So the origins go back. At that time, I was 22. I'll just be clear, I'm not 22 anymore. Haven't been for a long time. But it's lived in me since then, and over many years has morphed in a lot of different ways, a lot through connections to other artists. But I think the value for writers in particular is we're all taught to write when we're kids. We're taught to, here's a topic sentence and build your paragraph around evidence and that kind of thing. And so it disconnects us from the idea of being makers. I mean, for me, being an artist is being a maker. Like, I actually prefer the word maker in many ways. And so a lot of the ways I'd like to talk with writers and think about writing with writers is about that idea of being a maker. What's the unique thing that you're making? What's the original thing? What's the core of what you're trying to get at in what you do? I think everybody does that across the arts. For me, I work in text and image, and I've gotten really comfortable over 20 some years of working with artists across so many disciplines. So I have an insight, doesn't mean I have an expertise, but it's the same. My goal for everyone is like, what do you make? And how do we help you to get to the essence and the best work that you can do as a maker?
I think that's so great. I like that. I just want to be a maker. I just want to say that because for me, I'm coming from a lens of, doing theater work for so many years. But within that, of course, I'm doing like all these other visual arts and things like that. And I find that so often those of us who have gone through artistic training or arts training, we get really boxed in by, the training, like needing to really define your art and define who you are and then define the kind of art you do. And for, for someone like me, I remember the list started to get really long and specific. Okay, I'm a theater artist. No way. I'm an actor. I'm a director and producer. No way. I'm a theater artist working in experimental theater, physical theater, doing devised work. And at a certain point, what happens if you feel like you can't, one of those boxes doesn't fit anymore, and then you have like an artistic identity crisis? And I think what I really appreciate about the writing that you're sharing in this book and your concepts here around maker is just allowing yourself to be a maker and to let that evolve and to let other art forms fly in and out, to let that change and adapt. And I think that's so, it's so helpful. And I wish that the 20-year-old me had heard that earlier on.
Yeah, and in certain ways, it's kind of both and, right? I think it's like, yeah, you do want to be able to do that. I am like I mean, if we walk away with anything tonight, I would love that it's this idea that specificity matters, detail matters, and so being able to define yourself in a clear way. Yeah, I am a theater artist, but I'm interested in devised forms.
Right.
I work, I care about that. Like for me, it's the core of it is, what do you care about?
Yes.
And how does the definition arise from that? And how do you create the possibility for growth within that? Yeah, so I am that thing. Because I think often people, especially, people who are trying to figure out what is the next step for them as an artist, what I find is it's like, yeah, I'm this and I'm this and I'm this. And like, yeah, how in a year or 2-year period do you work with that? But if you're willing to accept a definition and really land into it and see where it can take you, I mean, let that definition lead you to possibility is kind of the way I would play with it.
Yes, right. I love that. Letting that lead you to what comes next and what could come next. Yeah. Can you share more about writing with images and writing as seeing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think my favorite question to anyone who's writing is, what do you see? I think often, particularly in academia these days, we lead people to concepts or ideas or to stances and that sort of thing. And there's value in that. There's a lot of, I mean, it's important to understand what you value and to bring that valuing into the work. But I think in my own experience, in my own life, and in the many failures that I've had, and in what I see with people who are trying to develop projects, whether it's in academic programs, whether it's because they have a book project that they have a contract for, or they're trying to get a contract for, it's that it breaks down because they can't really, lack of a better way of saying it, embody it. They can't really step all the way into it. And seeing is a way to do that. In the book, I talk about this, how I learned that from my friend Elliot Coleman, my mentor and friend Elliot Coleman, who had had a stroke. And so in the later part of his life, when I met him, he was a poet. He would write the poetry by reciting it, and one of us would record it. And so you could see, as he was working through the images and the poetry, how he could see them. And by seeing, I mean literally see. Like I actually think, can you see what you want to show on the page, and can you reach for that? But at the same time, I mean, the way I call it is, can you see into it? Can you see what it's about for you? And so for me, that's the core of working between writing and image. If you create an image, it's an opening. It's a way to say, this is the thing that I've made, and what is it for me? What is it that it's telling me? What am I in conversation with? What am I trying to reach for in that image? It's like, if I tell a story and the red shoes are an image in it, if I start to see that story through the red shoes, it tells me something, about why I was wearing them. It tells me something about where I might have been standing in relationship to other people. It might have been that my aunt, who was also in the room, was there. And then I start to think about, oh, my aunt and the influence she had on that event. Suddenly the story has the potential, I'll say, to become much deeper and richer because I've stepped all the way into an image. An image is, for me, a lack of a better way of saying, it's like a context. It's a context that can inform the work. If I'm willing to get to know it, I can play with it and work with it, and most often add to the writing.
Beautiful. Yes. I like that a lot. And I felt like I could, I don't identify as a writer, as a maker for sure. but not necessarily as a writer, though I write in certain other ways.
Sure.
And what I was feeling when I was reading you talking about, like, I could go in that way, the seeing the images and working. And it's also very somatic too. There's especially in the ones, obviously there's images that we can, make up and see, but in memory, and then comes the senses come back in and the body comes back in. I was like noticing that throughout when you were talking about seeing and going towards the image. So that felt really cool and accessible to me
That was something that I was thinking about when you were talking earlier about being a theater artist, but doing visual work and that kind of thing. Like, I think one of the real opportunities about being willing to connect beyond whatever your given art form is, let's just say writing, because that's, something that I've been writing about. But the idea that you can do these things, not necessarily because you are good at them, but because of what they can give you for the process that you are good at or you want to be good at. Like, again, that's why I think it connects to the whole definition thing. Yeah, I am a theater person. I am a theater artist. I do X, Y, and Z in that realm, but I can make images. I can use the process of making images. I could take photography. I can write. I can do all these things to help me. And that's why I think it's important to be in conversation across the arts, because then you do those things again, not that you necessarily have to always be good at them, but when you engage in conversations with others around the arts, you get insight to what makes them good at it, what makes their process. Like, the way I like to say it, more than good or bad, is it gives you insight to what makes them a genuine maker in that. And you can apply that a little bit or a lot. In other words, it's not about doing it as well as they do, to use that kind of language. It's about getting the insight and letting that, help you in certain kinds of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you said something in your book around exposure to other art forms and artists creates possibility. And I think it's coming back again to that same idea of like what is the inquiry, and also like how can you open that up in various ways, whatever ways are calling to you. And I think that's so important, because we tend to box ourselves in and think, this is the path of this particular medium. This is how we're successful in this. This is how we do that. And really, you're inviting us to be much more in relationship with our work, with ourselves, and with play.
Exactly.
And you talk a lot about play.
Yes. Yeah. So one thing, if you don't mind me saying, I don't want to take credit for something that's not mine. So it's my friend, my colleague, Chris Brandenberger, who used that idea that Chris. Putting art and artists in conversation with each other leads to possibility. I just use it.
Chris gets credit.
in my work. So kudos to Chris. And yes, and in relationship to what you're saying, that's very much why, we want to be in this conversation across the arts. Like, I think the idea of play is fundamental. For me, play is, it is that thing that leads to opening. I'm going to try this thing. It might not be mine to do over and over again, or it might not be my thing to specialize, but maybe it will lead me in. Or maybe I can take my expertise. Maybe I can take this idea that I know well of devised theater, and I can turn it on its head a little bit. So for me, it's always about that. It's always about choice, flexibility, possibility in the work.
And that you're giving yourself permission to do those things that are maybe outside your typical, your medium that you've identified, which I think is not always easy, and not always something that, the outside world encourages. So can you talk a little bit about failure? You talk a lot about failure in your book, and I'm curious about like this sense of play in connection with failure, and how we kind of and then there's the failure of, doing the thing that you really want to do that isn't, that is more maybe more painful.
Yeah, I think it's a super important aspect. I was talking to someone the other day, and kind of drawing the analogy to other things in life, but in baseball, if you succeed 3 times out of 10, you're considered, really accomplished, but in writing, I mean, I have the experience of sending a manuscript out 31 times and being rejected 31 times, and so I'm 0 for 31. It's like, that's not a great, it's not a great percentage. And so I think there is that way of engaging failure. There is, an industry that will tell you if you succeed or fail. There are classroom settings where, people with power will tell you you succeed or fail. There are group critiques and all those kinds of things that will tell you if your work works or it doesn't, meaning it works or it fails kind of thing. And so that idea of failure is just endless in creative work. What there is what you can create, what you have the capacity to create at any given moment of your life. There is learning to make choices that let you stay with the process, learning to make choices that allow you to keep learning and engaging and developing. And then there is developing your own inner sense of when the work works, when it's ready. And I think all of that factors into failure in a lot of different ways. I think so much of our training at makers requires us to land into that moment of understanding what our work is, why we're making it at any given moment, what we have to give it, realistically, what it can be, and then deciding if it's ready to go to a larger, deeper audience in some way. All along the way in that process, you can have, to use the language, success or failure. But I think it's just buying into what the actual process is and deciding that fundamentally you're going to stay with it, that you are a maker of work, that you understand, that you have capacity, and you're just going to keep finding the places where your work belongs. I think often I've said this in a couple of different settings, but I think so often work fails because people try to make it ready for something that it's not ready for. And so much for me, the message is know when it's ready and then decide. I mean, you still might fail. I'm sorry to say, you still might, but you might also really succeed if you know really how and why the work is ready, because that creates openings. It allows you to make the kinds of connections to people that you need to. It allows you to get access to certain kinds of environments. There are a lot of practical ways. I mean, I could talk about practical ways about that, but I'm just talking about process here right now. And so I think that idea of failure is fundamental, and it's just super important to recognize that. But it's also just a thing. It's just failing, right? It's just failing. Just like succeeding is just succeeding. And if you can kind of live in that space, then you can stay with the work and really mean it. There are other things, and for me, in some ways, this is as important or more important than, for writers and artists, is, I call it loss in my book, but you could label it in a lot of ways. It's about the things that happen in our lives that have an impact on our ability to make. And I think like trying to succeed in an environment in which you're struggling fundamentally with those kinds of things, that's, I think, a lot of what gets labeled as failure. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's about, I mean, you could call it a lot of things, but first it's about needing to recognize what's happening in the life and the kind of impact that it's having, and then realizing what can I make in this environment where I'm experiencing all that. And yeah, I mean, there are periods of your life where maybe being a maker is pretty difficult, if not impossible, where you have limited access both to your materials and your time, or maybe you have a lot of time to give to it, but there's so much going on, you can only enter it in a certain way. There are some times where you can push through, and there are other times when you can't. Again, for me, it's a lot about just, yeah, that's how it is, and fundamentally, it's about what I've learned over my life is there's a lot of choices about that.
Yeah.
We were talking about that earlier. Sometimes it's forgetting that these things aren't dictates. They don't come from high and I have to actually follow them. There's not somebody in power who gets to decide. It's that I have a lot of choices. And if I keep my choices in front of me, if I stay aware of them and decide to use them and work with them, then yeah, I can make my work. And I'm a huge believer in this. If you fundamentally make your work, you will find the audiences for it. Might be in unexpected ways, but I really do believe that.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're talking about sustainability here too,
For
which
sure.
is like there's a piece of it that's resilience for all those failures. And yeah, it's just it feels like it's really important to bring acceptance into awareness and acceptance around these seasons. These seasons in our creative lives where there might be transitions that are in our, regular everyday, I don't know what we want to call our not creative lives because I feel like they're so integrated.
Sure.
But I think sometimes as artists, we can think that they're separate somehow. And it's like we should be, no, yeah, my cat died and I lost my job, but like, why is my manuscript on hold right now? Like I have a 5-year plan, And I think what you're speaking to is actually like you're saying it so simply, but I think it's so profound. Like there's so many of us that I think don't take the time to really be like, where am I right now? What is my capacity? And how do I make my work and from here, from this place? And I think something that I really want you to talk more about, which I really appreciated, was your, art making as a relationship. And talking, you just said it too, is like, this idea that you're in dialogue with your art, with your relationship, in relationship with your art, you're not alone in that. And it's also not separate from what's happening in your life, where you are in this moment. Can you say more about those things?
Yeah, sure. If you don't mind, I'll just go back to a second too, to what I heard you just saying, which is it's another, I think, one of those things that's a both and, right? Which is, yeah, you have a lot going on in your life, but would it be helpful to you to be working on your manuscript? Right. Can you really carve out time? Do you have to put it all away because something negative happened in your life? But can you have choice around that? Can you say, yeah, this is what I have to give it, and I'm going to give it all of that right now? So I'm a huge believer in commitment. I'm not in any way saying don't commit to your work, because what allows you to stay with it, what allows you ultimately, to find the work and to bring it forward is to make that commitment. I don't think that's what you're saying either, to be clear. But I think, it's like, so like, it's like, can she ever just give us a straight answer?
No, we're talking about the arts.
No. It's like perpetually a both and kind of on but how do you see both sides? Or like the multiple sides of it, and then find your own way to work with it. I really love this idea of art making as relationship.
Yes.
It's an area that actually someone said to me, oh, I wish you had like written a bit more about that. And so I was thinking, yeah, I should be thinking more about it. So maybe I'll think aloud here for a moment. But when I had that kind of discovery, I was working with someone on a project, on a book project, and they were like, gosh, I don't know how to get this work to move forward. I never quite realize what I want to say, and I'm just wondering what's wrong with my manuscript. And what I realized in working with this person is, and this is what they don't teach you when they're teaching you to write, writing as communication, which seems kind of odd because it's about communication, which is relationship, which is that you are always in relationship when you are writing. And then I would translate that to making as well. Like I said, first of all, you're in relationship with yourself. That's what I mean about this idea of being in a dialogue with yourself about what am I doing? I'm not just trying to do what the assignment is or because someone told me I should write a novel. Like, actually, why? What is this about for me? What am I reaching for? That's what I mean when I'm talking about that relationship. It's a lot of, what am I reaching for? What does this work for me? And how do I do that? And then, there's this idea of you draft it, you work on it, and that relationship continues. Like, I talk a little bit about this of learning to be both a writer of the work and observer of the work. And I kind of love that process. Once you really get into it, and I think you can do this again across the arts, I'm just kind of focusing on writing here for a moment, but that idea that you're seeing as a maker, and you're also seeing as a reader of what has been made. And like when you really get into that relationship, you kind of never get divorced from it. Like, I don't think I know how to read anymore without doing both things at the same time. But it's empowering and it's sustaining because you can hold the idea of where the work is trying to go. And at the same time, you can say, yeah, here are all the ways that someone who doesn't know all that is viewing what is being created here. And so you ask that question, you ask that question, like, why is this here? How does this relate to this other thing? Or this is an interesting image. I wonder why it doesn't get articulated anymore. And so for me, that idea of relationship has become profoundly fundamental, but it begins in that idea that if you can't be in good relationship with yourself when you're making, then it's already in trouble, to try to get to the other levels of relationship. But fundamentally, it's this, which is treat yourself and who you're trying to reach with your work just the way you would anybody else in a relationship, right? We just sort of forget that.
Yeah.
Like, if you would be rude to people in your relationship, then play with being rude. I mean, in fiction writing, that can be one of the wonderful things. Yeah, that person's going to be wildly rude with everyone. So let me see what I can do with that. But I think that can really it's a guiding principle, around the making of the work, and at the same time about the way in which you talk with yourself about how you make the work.
And where you are right now in this moment.
And where you are
your life
and where you are right now.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a big one. I love that you said if you're not in a good relationship with yourself, you're going to be in trouble. And I think the art is telling us something about ourselves. So I think it's that idea of like not trying to separate as if there's some sort of like objective, like some sort of artist that in you that's just this like objective, doesn't have this life part as much. It's kind of like on this train doing this thing. Yeah, I feel I feel like that's really important to be like, where am I right now? Why this right now? And the inquiry around it.
Absolutely.
The self-inquiry is really just as important as the inquiry that, the concept and the work that you're.
The idea for me is that the work originates inside you. Ultimately, it wants to extend beyond you. And relationship is important in both aspects of that. A language that I used to use a number of years ago when I first started talking about this was writing is a process of translation. So in other words, it's like you have to say it to yourself so you can translate it for someone else. You are always in the making process in that realm of creating something that you're translating ultimately for something larger than you. And that's relationship. You either can make the translation, you can not make the translation, let me say it like this, you can make the work and you can affect the translation, or you can't. And somewhere, relationship is kind of a through line all the way through that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Okay, I have a question for you about quitting.
Yeah.
Because in your book you say, I quit writing as you're writing this book. So I would love to hear more around your relationship with quitting.
I kind of love that. I love that it's kind of like the little inside joke of the book of like, yeah, I quit writing, but while I was doing that, I made a work of text and image about writing,
Right.
And so I quit sort of. But I actually really did in a way. The quitting thing for me is about realizing I didn't have a direction. I didn't know what I wanted to say anymore. I grew up in an artistic era of metafiction, of writers like John Barth, who was quoted saying all stories have been told, there's just new ways of telling stories, kind of thing. And so it was very much an era of I would call playfulness, but almost in a kind of ironic playfulness, rather than genuine playfulness. And so I think one of the real lessons I had to learn about being in the world of writer artist was that genuineness matters. I call it really meaning making, that there are reasons why we make our work. That's why, this language of inquiry comes in so much to the way that I talk about the writing process. But yeah, I mean, it was fundamentally, if all I can do is someone who can use technique well. And I think I was pretty good at that, of thinking of really interesting ways to make work and give it form and all that. But it's not really fundamentally about something, or it was fundamentally about something. I just didn't access that, right? So it's like, yeah, I quit. And so I actually think there's a positive in quit, because it's liberating, right? It's, yeah, I don't have what it takes to actually do this. So I can quit, meaning like I can quit forever. I can really not do that. I could go, do something else in my life. Or I can quit and I can start again. And that's really the way I like to frame it. For me, it was I decided, well, I'll just create a brand new art form. That'll be my way. And I did. I did it for like 15, 16 years. And that's really how I got into creating text and image work, which of course means I never quit being a writer. I was just always doing it. I took what I learned from Eliot about seeing, and then I applied it in my own way to the way that I wanted to construct work. And honestly, what happened was I came back to wanting to be a writer, So then when I kind of quit making work of text and image, which I still do occasionally, it wasn't a quit. It was, yeah, I'm going to defer. I'm going to defer this process to go and do something else. But it was about understanding that I knew what my work was and I knew what it was about. So therefore, I could choose the forms that I wanted to work with. It was no longer that, oh, these are the forms that people work in. You need to apply those forms and make your work. The work arises, in my view, from the thing that we have to say. It arises from what we see and from what we have to say, and that willingness to pursue it, and to make it out of that pursuit.
Yeah, yeah. And do you feel like you really had to say, I quit this in order to go to the next thing? Like it gave you permission to like drop it?
I would say, I mean, I'm a person for whom words are like incredibly important. Every word means something. And if you've ever worked with me, you'll know that 90 times in working with me, I'm saying, and what does that word mean to you? So I am deliberately using that word quit because it's a little more dramatic.
Yeah.
And it was like a stop point.
Right.
Yeah. Like I am turning away from this and I'm going to come back different. Or actually, when I quit, I didn't say I'm going to come back different. I said, oh, I'll do a drawing and I'll see where that
Right.
leads me. But I would say, if you feel like you need to shift your work, find the word that works for you. Quit might be more dramatic than you want. I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to go a sideways path. I mean, it's about being able to find your process. And so I think this is really fundamentally what we're talking about here is we have so many people, organizations, mythologies, perspectives about art making, telling us how you make art, what it is to be an artist. I am saying, find your language, find your way of seeing, and follow that. And so, yeah, if you need to quit in order to be able to make a shift, then quit. But if you need to take a pause or have a little, other kind of experience, do that. I mean, language, I think language is critically important, whether you're a writer or not, because what you say to yourself has an impact on how you work.
Yeah. I love that you say quit, and then there was never a question that you would not be making. And I think that's a big piece of it too, is that whether you use quit or shift or whatever transition, that there's this fundamental knowing, knowledge base inside you that is like, I am a maker and this is not going away. It's just, I'm dropping that for now.
Yeah, and for me, like, I didn't know that. It's not like I knew that. I mean, I'm of course writing about this. It's 2000. I wrote this 2023, 2024, and I started that work in 1996. So basically 20 years of doing the work, and then before I start articulating it in this way. So yeah, but I think it's also about that, and I think two things are important in that. One, I just knew to quit. Or I just did quit, and then the openings became, so there was the opportunity for that. And second, it's that, yeah, once I did that, I was willing to step in to an opportunity. So I think it's also that willingness to be able to say, yeah, I'm not sure what's going to come on the other side of this, but if I do the thing that I need to do, which is take this manuscript and put it in a drawer, or decide that this theater piece that I've been working on for 4 years, I don't have the time or attention to do it, but I could do something smaller right now. So I'm going to quit this one theater piece and I'm going to do this other thing. That's really the kind of thing that I'm talking about. You don't know necessarily what's going to happen when you make the decision, but if you don't make the decision, you don't know, right?
Yeah. And it all comes back to being in relationship with yourself and being really aware of, like, I need to quit right now. That's what's going on. But you also talk about work that you quit or put down and then found again.
Yeah.
And were able to, like, repurpose, use in different ways. Can you share about that? Because I think that's a really beautiful idea, that it could come back around even 20 years later in some other form.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two ways in which that's alive for me. One is in the example that you're asking, and this relates to, for example, things like, writing a novel at a particular point that, was one of those that got the plethora of, rejection notices and, put in a box somewhere. And then especially when I started making work in text and image, I would take these things that I had created in another setting, and I would add to them, or I would cut them up, and I would build, I started making this whole body of work. And this is where this idea, I've actually really appreciated a couple times now that you brought up the word box. I hope we can talk about boxing at some point, like the importance of box, because actually, like, we were using it in the context of box being kind of a negative, limiting thing, but actually for me, it's a place of immense possibility. But I would be like, oh yeah, I wrote this story and it's not gone anywhere, so I'll just take a box and I'll create the story in a box. And so I would literally make the characters, and I would sew their jewelry or make them a bag to carry where they were walking. And suddenly the story had a kind of life and dimension that it never, it didn't have in the rejection pile, and in other ways too, it would be that I would take parts of things and add them into something else. But it's also about, being able to do that kind of thing of taking a short story or something like that didn't work at a particular time of life, and understanding. I have one piece that I'm working on right now, and I understood that I just wasn't willing to tell the actual story. Like, it's a super interestingly constructed piece of work, but there's a whole story underneath it that I thought if I structured it in a fun enough way it would just convey it in a sense without me having to convey it. And it's like, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So either decide you want to actually tell the story, and you can do that in a really interesting way, or just leave the piece. It's not one that you want to write. And so that idea, that things can have a life at another time in your artistic life, or B, you can remake them or
Yeah.
reuse them. But the other thing that really came up for me in the writing of this book is that whole first section about Elliot. I actually wrote that first piece about seeing. I'm bad on dates, so forgive me for if anyone listening to this knows better than I, but I wrote it, and we put it in one of our Mission at 10th journals, which was our inner arts journal for a long time as part of the MFA. But let's say it's 12, 14 years ago that I wrote that piece. I did some reworking for it, for this book. But what I discovered was that there was a whole telling of the Elliot story that if I was going to include that I had to tell in this book. And that was really a point, like talk about quitting. There were several points in the writing of those pieces where I was like, I don't know if I can do this work. One, I don't know if I can reach back far enough to remember and see. I don't know if I want to, like the kinds of things that suggest to me, or these other side stories that come up and how I should include them or not include them. And I remember at one point just saying, I don't think I can do this. And then saying to myself, well, you could just make some choices about it. And I realized, yeah, the task is to tell the fuller story. And I think this can be an important thing. The task is to tell the fuller story, not all the story or the complete story or every aspect of the story, but the fuller story. And so and that was my language, the fuller story. So what is the fuller story? The fuller story is one that has various perspectives, so you see it from more than one vantage point. Because it didn't feel right to let it live as something that was, oh, I just had this cool relationship with this wonderful artist who taught me about seeing, and then unfortunately he died. All of that's accurate, but it's partial, right? And to me, that's a very, very interesting thing, because all work is partial in a way, but how partial, in the sense of how much of the story needs to be there for it to work. So I went through this whole dialogue with myself. Hopefully readers feel great about the ways that I oriented toward that. But for me, it was a very, very important process. And so that idea of, both what I call a kind of reoffering, has multiple. It can appear and be necessary for the work in a variety of ways. That was a kind of round the barn answer about a lot of stuff, but hopefully it makes some sense.
Yes, it made sense to me. And okay, so you brought up offering,
Yeah.
which I also really liked in your book. So after you quit writing, you were sort of in this phase of making boxes and text and art together. And then you sort of decided, oh, it feels really good if I make this art to be a gift.
Yes.
And when you wrote that, I was like, yeah, that really makes sense. And then you kind of broke down why that wasn't such a great idea for you anymore. And I'm curious if you can say how you kind of moved into offering from there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a really important shift when I got involved in making work into text and image. Maybe again, I'll go around the question and actually come to it. I started with a very simple idea of making postcards, because this whole idea of meaning making was super important to me. And again, anybody who's worked with me knows that I think postcard is the most perfect art form. You get text, you get image, and you get a stamp. And the stamp, like again, play with that word, it's like my stamp of what I am saying. And then if the postcards always have a handmade stamp on them. And so, but what I began to discover, and the reason I'm saying this here, is after I did that work for a while, I wanted it to have what I thought of as dimension and depth. So I created postcards that had, that, you know, would like stand, like that had dimension. You know, they had things built onto them. You know, things that started to be sewn into them. And so it was too flat of a medium.
Right.
And I needed it to have like texture and, you know, depth and that kind of thing. And so then from that, it was like, oh, well, if I could do that on a flat surface, what could I do in a box?
Right.
And then I could create a whole world in a box. And then after that, I went to hardboards, and because then you could present the world. You didn't have to, you know, look inside of it. Anyway, that was a little of the creative trajectory. But the idea was in each one of those things that, you know, could you give it? Could you give it to someone else? And that was my way of kind of in my own process of working through things that are production made for an audience versus things that are made from, you know, the origins of one's process and the origins of what one can make as an artist and see where it leads. But I realized the thing about gift giving is this: what if somebody doesn't want it? Right? Like, how many times have you got the, you know, the Christmas sweater or the, you know, the package of, the thing of mustard that you're supposed to love or whatever. You know, it's just it's a thing that you get, and maybe you want it or you don't. And I didn't want that to be part of the process. So I started doing this inquiry around the word offering. You know, and I was thinking about the ways in which I understood it in my own life. Like, if you ever went to church when you were a kid and there was the tithe, the offering that you were supposed to give in the service. So it was given, you know, quote, freely in that way, but there wasn't an expectation attached to it. And I really love that about art making. So you can offer it, and maybe the offering will be accepted. Maybe someone will say, yes, I'm going to publish your book. I'm going to put your theater work on stage. I'm going to have this exhibit. But you can still offer it regardless of, you know, of what happens. And then you can offer it again and again. This is again what we were just talking about is, so in this era, you offer and it doesn't get, you know, the offering doesn't get accepted in a certain way, you can say, okay, do I keep offering? Or is this one of the things I put to the side, I think more about? Or do I deconstruct it and construct it, and I can offer it again? It just feels, for me, a more expansive way of being in the world.
And you're talking about agency too. So it's empowering, and there's agency around it, which is different from gifting. There's some agency in gifting, but there's definitely how do you feel?
Yeah, and then you got to write the thank you note. The other one's going to write the thank you note, or
and I do think that also speaks to sustainability too. Is that you have this this agency that's like, when you're ready, you can offer this thing, and also this kind of letting go of the attachment to the thing and letting the thing go out into the world, and maybe be picked up in a way, like you've said, that you weren't expecting, that there's like a change in expectation. And it doesn't mean that the thing isn't important to you or that you don't have ideas of where you would want this to go. But there's something really beautiful about offering that just sort of relaxed me in my whole body when you said that around art making, because I think so often there's so much about like, what will people think? How do I get them to like me? And you're sort of like, no, it's coming from me going out, and let's see where it goes from there, because it is in a world, right? It's not, you can't direct where it will go as much as you want to. And so sitting back with that and being like, this is an offering, I think would allow me to enjoy the process a lot more, and to feel like I'm more, again, in relationship, a part of the external world my art is going out into. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important also. Again, for me, it's one of those kind of both and things, because I feel like sometimes when I say things like this, then someone out there could be saying, yeah, it's just not very practical, right? You know, but it is for me practical, you know, like I am immensely practical. I'm not saying in any way, don't be confident when you offer. Don't think that your work has a future, that it can belongs there. I'm not saying when you write your query letter to an agent, you know, to try to get them interested in your book, that you shouldn't feel like my work is ready and, you know, it belongs with this agent and it belongs with the world. I'm saying that it's about your own way of being in that. Like I'm gonna commit to this project and I'm gonna offer it. And then I'm gonna kind of let things, you know, again, if I say play out, sounds like, oh, I don't feel like you have agency, but I think that is agency.
Yeah.
I think so much in life, and so therefore so much in the life of being an artist is understanding what you control and what you don't. And so what I can control is what I make and how I offer it to the world. And I can be smart about the other ways, like how I build connections and how I understand marketplace and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, I can also be content that what I can do is bring it forward. I can offer it out and I can see what happens. And I can be in, you're right, be in relationship with myself about how I am about what happens with that.
Right. Right. And it comes back to choice too, of like what you want to do around this offering. Like what are my choices here? How do I feel about those? Yeah. So you did mention Elliot, and I wanted to just ask you about mentors and the role of mentor, which you, I'm sure, are for many of our students here. But can you say more about sort of the relationship of the mentor, particularly after school, you know, like when you've kind of moved into the world? I'm curious about mentorship in that direction too.
I think again, it's kind of one of those things to think about when I hear that word. What do I see? What do I mean? You know, for me, it's specific in a way. Like I was very fortunate when I went to London in 1978. Michael Lynch, who ran the program that I was enrolled in for Antioch University, had brought Elliot over, who Elliot had been at Johns Hopkins University for, I don't know, 35 years and had just retired. And he wanted to create a little group of people to work one-on-one with Elliot. Well, there were four of us that, or three of us that actually met with Elliot. Michael was one of them. So I kind of just landed into that in a certain way. But from that relationship, I saw the power of what could happen, of having that access. And I'll tell you, for me, one of the things that really stands out, and I think this is important around mentorship, was when I saw Elliot and Michael in conversation about Elliot's work, that like sitting there as part of the process, but also as an observer, I realized how much I absorbed that. I realized the way that they spoke with each other was based on a long-term talking about their work with each other. And it gave them a way of being in conversation and in relationship that was not only valuable to them, but was very, very valuable to the work. And so I think just implicit in that, you know, I carried forward in my own life. How do you create that for yourself? So if mentorship is finding those people who can talk with you about your work in a deep way, I say yes, it's really the thing that everyone wants to reach for. And I think the reality is, like, you can be in a degree program, or you can have those kinds of experiences where that can happen. But when you're outside that, I think there are other ways that you can reach for it. Some of us don't have lives like that. I mean, most of my, the last 35 years of my life has been, being the primary person to bring in the money, being the parent, all that sort of stuff. So building big communities of people to connect with wasn't really something that, I had a lot of opportunity to make happen. But I've continued to be mentored in so many ways. I mean, in my book, when you read about the time that I spent having the opportunity to sit in rehearsals at Lyons Ballet with Alonzo King, it was like, that's a kind of mentorship, right? Just being able to witness that work and to seeing what was happen. I would say one of the things that people discount a lot is what other work can teach them.
Right.
How much do you look at other work? How much do you try to see it from the inside? How much do you read or listen to other artists talk about the making of their work and what you want to take from that? For sure, as much as you can, find someone who will, can you get hired to like sit in their studio and learn how they make and that sort of stuff. But if those kinds of things don't happen, there's so much work out there. There's so many people articulating about their work. I just really want to encourage people to keep reaching for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
But yes, mentorship, however, again, I really encourage people to think about, yes, what does that look like for me? And how do I, try to create it for myself?
Yeah. I think it's super important. And I think what you're saying is sometimes, especially when you're out of school, it's like, I had all these amazing mentors that would look at my work all the time and like, where do I go? What do I do now? But I think that idea of also bridging across the arts, and even sometimes even like, listening to a podcast can be a sort of mentorship. It's different. It's not the same, but it's like there's these ways that I feel like it's important for us to, as artists, to realize that work still counts. Like that's still those little. Whoa, I have ruined it. Okay.
But also,
Yeah.
I mean, just like, I think it's also one of those things where it's like, let it come to you in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
Like I would qualify the couple of conversations we've had about getting ready for this conversation as mentorship.
Right.
Like you've asked me things, you've talked with me about things. It's made me think differently. It's made me really think about, oh, what do I have to say about that? Or if I approach it from this lens. So like just being in our conversation it's required a kind of learning from me. That's mentorship.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not always like the big label. Oh, I've got a mentor now.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah,
anytime you're learning, you have access to that.
Yeah, exactly. Anytime you're learning. I think that is the key to what you've been talking about, is this like joy of just inquiry, of curiosity, of just continuing to try to understand and learn something different. Really feeds your art, and that's a great takeaway for so many of us. So my last question, I think, would be, I'm curious what you would say to those folks, like so many of us, who are maybe in the middle of a project. And one of my favorite sayings is, in the middle, change in the middle, or a project in the middle feels like failure.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, if like those folks who've like, the spark, the initial idea was there, you're like, and then you got into the momentum of it, and then you're in the middle. And you're kind of in that place of like, and I feel like you would have some good advice for that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's like, it's really about coming back to this idea of like, why are you doing it? What do you want from it? And situating it within your life. The middle's the middle. It's not a beginning. It's not an end. But if you stay interested in it,
Right.
then you can bring it to fruition. In my book, I had that. I was telling you that about the chapter on Elliot. It's like, yeah, I might just cash this in. Really, either I've got to figure this out, or because I have a requirement to write a certain number of words, I'm gonna have to do something brand new, or I'm just gonna fail at this project. So in the middle, and part of the way I solved it in that moment was, why are you making this so big? Like, really, you've now created this whole big thing that you have to create. So let's not do that. Let's start again with the simple thing. You know X, you know Y. What if you tell that story? This is the thing that I come back to a lot. What do I see? What do I see that I'm still interested in that helps me to move forward? What do I have to say? And how do I keep connecting with that to help me move forward? What is the story that I have to tell about this particular aspect? And if I tell that story, I'm in process. And if I keep that attitude of I am creating, and at the same time I am observing myself as creator, and I'm seeing that I'm moving it forward, then I'm not really in the middle. I'm moving things forward.
Right.
That's it. It's like the question is, how do I keep the work moving forward? And then eventually you do. It's forwarded.
Yeah.
It is realized.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for our conversation, but I have some audience questions for you. Let's see here. How do you define success or failure, and what does discernment mean to you in the context of evaluating the difference?
Yeah, so I'd love to understand a little more about what the person means by discernment. But one, I think that for me, I think I get to decide, what is success or what is failure. I just kind of accept failure. I mean, I sort of hold it playfully these days. I think I said to you in another conversation we had, let me enumerate the ways that I've already failed today. I said I was going to work for an hour and a half on a project. I only worked 45 minutes.
Right.
Failure. I said I was going to get 1,000 words written, and I got 900. Partial failure. So it's just kind of always that. Or I said I was going to do the query letter for the agent, and I got 2 sentences done. So so the failure is a constant.
Yeah.
So I just kind of try not to give it too much. Big failure is, I think, a thing that is more difficult to negotiate. Yes, you are in the process of sending a manuscript out. It's not getting the kind of read. So how long do you tolerate that? Do you take 10 rejections and then you rethink a little bit? Or do you take 30? Again, I think it's sort of like, what is your tolerance level?
Right.
But it's also, what is the information that you're getting from that? Success, I would love to emphasize success. Success is what we were just talking about. It's moving forward. It's getting a piece of work ready to do the next thing, which is to bring it to the world. You're in success every time you get to that place. What happens with it is a further success,
Right.
potentially,
Right.
but success lives there. And I think part of what helps to make the creative work sustainable, the process sustainable, is being able to hold that kind of attitude. I think it all requires a discernment. I mean, for me, I said it before, I think it's about you, how you understand, I'm big on this. How do you understand yourself as artist, and how do you understand your artwork? The more, I'll use your word, agency, claim the agency around that. Live in relationship to your definitions and your values, and then decide your success and failure in relationship to that. If bigger and better things happen because of it, great. If it doesn't, then what are the mediums and the ways in which you want to create community around your work?
Could I just get that in a poster form that I could just put on my wall? That's great.
One of the things that's super funny about me is I'll say things like that, and then you'll ask me a bit later, and okay, like, what did I just say? So maybe it's nice here that there's a recording we can look back on.
Yeah, we'll be able to, I'll make the poster. Okay, our next question is, what does writing mean for you personally and spiritually in your life?
I think spirituality is it's a very interesting thing for me. A long time ago, um, uh, well, my roommate, when I lived in London, and she was part of the group that was in the mentorship with Elliot, she was a former nun, right? And so very spiritual, religious person. And I said to her, yeah, like I'm not really spiritual. I'm very humanist oriented. And she said, you're like one of the most spiritual people I've been around. So I think that's an ongoing question for me. I think we live in relationship to our humanness, and we make work because we are trying to convey the range of what it is to be human. And if that's a deeply spiritual thing, I'm good with that. I don't think too much about. I acknowledge in many ways. I love like to incorporate things like dreams or altered realities or that sort of stuff. But I live in that idea of like trying to convey the full range of human experience. And I forgot already, what does it mean for me to be a writer right now? I think what it means for me is to, as much as I can, articulate, like I'm getting to a place in life where what I have to share is what's new for me and some new work I'm getting ready to create, but also what I have to share is what I've learned, and I'm really trying to focus on that in certain ways of really getting into a granular level. The deep insight I've had for myself is that detail matters. Didn't really use this word in the book, but I'm really centering in on it now. That detail is another way of thinking about image. If you see the detail of experience, it is an opening to more. So I started doing more of this writing. Could be viewed as a little obsessive of like incorporating detail, but each detail is a kind of opening or a question for me. And as a writer, I'm very interested in what do our stories tell us about what we don't know, and what we're trying to access through, in this case, words. And so I'm interested in using writing to uncover the stories I either don't recognize, don't know well enough yet, need to know, or are there for the finding if I really engage in the process. And the last thing I'll say about that is I've been thinking deeply since I finished this book about the idea of imagining, not just imagining like fictional, but because of this piece that I did about Elliot, about how imagination, using what we imagine, is a doorway to more. I feel like one of the things we lack as a culture right now is, we could just imagine our way to something more. And I'd like to use writing to do that.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Writing tends to serve different purposes across different world cultures, ranging from preserving harmony and control to inviting dialogue and dissent. Could you comment on how these differences in writers' objectives might influence the creative process?
I think it's a really, really interesting question, and I'd love to be in a dialogue about that. Obviously, I feel aware of my limits as a person, but I felt my possibilities and the limits of, my cultural knowledge and awareness. But I would say, for me, I think the short answer is we bring who we are, and who we are is who we are as we understand ourselves in our family constructs, from our cultures, from our connection to larger cultures like our country. And there is always the possibility, this is why for me, in so many ways, why I am always exposing myself to other people's work, which is a connection to who they are and what their cultures are. Why I am always interested in connecting internationally, because of the ways in which other cultures and countries teach us about our work. So I think that, yeah, I want to acknowledge the limits of my perspective and what I know because of the range of experiences I have, and also how important it is to always be open to the next thing, to what the next exposure, and to the kinds of things that I need to be exposed to. To answer the question, I would say you are what you have been exposed to in your life is what you bring to your process, and being in relationship and in dialogue with that is important for your agency in your process. What's important for all of us as artists is to continue to have the exposures to each other so that we can, bring it and learn, and I don't want to say apply that, because I think that could be interpreted, to learn from others, to see what it might open for us. And if you view art making and the making of artwork as more of a question process than an actual resolution of saying something, I think that opening across cultures becomes even more important.
Right, and that's sort of speaking to the different creative processes there, right? There's one that's like, I'm going to get this out. This is what I'm saying, and versus the inquiry piece.
I'll give an example. I was talking with one of my students just the other day, and in her culture, there are these rituals around coffee, etc., and the artwork arises. And so it was really listening to the experience of the ritual. And what I was interested in was having her say more about that ritual, and then asking, do you want to incorporate aspects of the ritual, not just the understanding of the ritual, into the artwork? In other words, we don't know enough to see it the way you do. So if you evoke some of it for us in the work, then we're still observers, but we're a little closer to it than we were before. And so for me, that's the opening that, I think an artist can consider in their work.
Translating thoughts into words is an individual, personal process that can take many forms. What routines do you have for fostering inspiration for writing, and what might block it? Is there a role that community might play?
Sure. Again, I think it's about what do you need to help you move your work forward, and B, what do I want to say this? What does your life allow for? Right. And how much can you massage what your life allows for? Because sometimes, so it's like, yes, community, it might be easy to join a writing group for some people. For some people, it might be really difficult to join a writing group. So what's a variation on that you might be able to create? But I think it begins in, what are the things that are going to help you identify your work, understand your work, and move it forward? Then, how do I make those things happen? I forgot the first part of the question.
What routines do you have for fostering inspiration for writing, and what might block it?
I thought a little bit about inspiration. I even talked about this a little bit in the introduction to the book, because I was thinking, yeah, how do I feel about inspiration? Because inspiration is kind of one of those things. It's kind of like, having a cappuccino, right? It excites your system for a moment, for a little while, and then you have to go have another cappuccino if you want that same. And so it's like, yeah, how do you connect with an inspiration that really is sustaining in a way?
Yes,
I think it's about having the practices beyond the inspiration. Everybody needs to be inspired. And so is it listening to a podcast? Is it doing a conversation? Is it having a ritual? Like some people I know, and I did this for a while, of just like, I would always read before I would start writing so that I could really connect with like the idea of the art world and communities and the creative process before I ever started to make things. So I think finding those kinds of habits or rituals, whatever you want to call them, but at the same time, I think being able to, again, be in this process of what can actually work for you given the life that you have. The things that I do, I stay in question mode. Like I have the same kinds of experiences that everyone does. I just said it, like, oh, maybe I'll just quit. I can't really do this. I'm actually not good enough to do this. But then I've have over time developed the capacity to say, okay, yeah, thanks for that. And what if you did this? Like I have that repetition of questions. What do you see? What if you start there? What if you just tell that story? I really like the mode of questioning as a way of, to use that language, being inspiring. Okay, yeah, you probably can't do that. But what you could do is tell one more story.
Right.
Or you could read over what you've written and see what you think really does have life in it and maybe do something with that. Or, sometimes it's like, I could just do some more research today because I really don't know the direction that I want to go. And research might be actually connecting with a source beyond myself. It might be investigating my own memories. It might be going to a box that has a bunch of photographs and saying, oh yeah, I forgot about that piece, or I forgot that person was there. I mean, research for me is a really, really open-ended aspect to creative work. But I would say short answer for me is to ask a question that allows you to move the work forward. That's a kind of inspiration for me.
Yeah, yeah. And there can be a lot of power in actually saying, I really don't know.
Yes, I really
And
don't
then
know.
and then what comes after that? What is, what are the questions? What are the things you can poke at?
Yeah, and not knowing is like it's a gift.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Like in a world where you have to know all the time.
Yeah, I really don't know.
I
what's
really don't know.
happening here.
I really don't know. Maybe I could maybe I could just do this then.
Okay. The medium of creative expression usually dictates whether the art is enduring or ephemeral. How does your guidance in the context of written word translate into ephemeral contexts such as performance art, real-time improvisation, or other areas where creativity needs to be delivered on demand?
I think it's such a good question, and something that I've been kind of thinking about in the next realm of my development as person who thinks about conversation across the arts. This idea that, yeah, you have to show up and deliver. I say something about it in my book because when I broke my shoulder when I was getting ready to write this book, and I realized, oh, maybe I just can't do this book because I have a broken, can't use my arm. And so I started thinking about that idea. I started watching these little Jimmy Fallon things on YouTube.
The tiny, the instruments,
the instruments where they use kid instruments, and I just saw one with like Sheryl Crow where they were saying, but she was singing and they were accompanying her with kid instruments, and I thought there's something about this where you just show up and you play, you do the work, and so I think it all does translate. It's that in all art forms, it may not be as time bound, but you have to make that commitment to just show up and do the work. And so I think that, I think I've done a lot of work in the MFA with people who work in areas like choreography and that kind of thing. So I've seen that work of, how they have to apply it, to a date and a time, and they have to show up on stage. But for me, I think the process still holds, which is you have to know why you're doing the work. You have to know what you want to do, and then you factor that into the process. I think what it does is it brings a real genuineness to the idea of failure, right? You show up and you do it, and you do it in the best possible way you can in the moment, and then you let go of whether it's success or failure. Not so easy to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure I have a great answer to what that person is asking me, so I'm going to give it more thought.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Can you say more about the peer-to-peer mentorship implicit in the interdisciplinary program like the MFA at CIS? What's gained by conversation among writers, visual artists, and performers, and what do we really learn from each other across mediums?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite things to talk about. I think there are two things that distinguish our MFA from some others. The first, and it relates to the interdisciplinarity, is this idea of inquiry, that all work begins with inquiry. There is what you want to make, and there's why you want to make it, and being in dialogue around that is super important. When you add into that, connecting with a community in an interdisciplinary perspective I think it's borne out. I think you augment that inquiry in a couple of ways. The example that I use a million times when I talk about this is if you could take the salons that happened at Gertrude Stein's house at the beginning of the 20th century and morph that, into the kind of experience we want to have in the MFA, that's what we're really talking about. No one really knew when all those artists sat around on Saturday night how much they would change and how the artwork would change just out of conversation. And what happens, I think, is two things. One, when you sit in an interdisciplinary community, you have to become more articulate about your inquiry and your work. In other words, to translate, in order to be able to get the kind of feedback that's going to be useful for you, you end up reaching for more and saying more about your work, and then everyone can join in around that. Second, and I think for me, this is kind of the most fun part, there's this thing that I call kind of like osmosis. You just have all these exposures, and over time, you're different because of it. You've sort of like taken it all in. You think about movement. Like one of the things for me about being able to sit in the studio with Alonzo King and the dancers in Lions Ballet was to understand something new about commitment. This kind of thing that just came up in the other question of just showing up in the moment and giving it all you can. Alonzo calls it the kind of maximum contribution that you can make in the rehearsal, in the performance, that sort of thing. And so for me, it's like I'm not going to go and become a performer because of that exposure, but I'm different because I've been exposed to those things. Yeah, short answer to that.
And I can say that's true for me reading your book too. I got to do some of your writing exercises because there's practices in the book, and that was really a new way of seeing for me as well. And so I kind of felt like I had that little mini experience.
Nice. That's really great. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you so much to Emlyn for all she's giving to prepare and to have this evening with me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. Yay.
Now we can stand.